Everyone to the Credential as You Go Summit on Higher Education Quality Assurance and Incremental Credentialing. I'm Holly Zanville, one of the 3 co-leads of the Credential as You Go National Initiative, along with Nan Travers from SUNY Empire State College and Melissa Goldberg from the Corporation for a Skilled Workforce. Last year, we hosted a summit on language issues impacting credentialing. The issues around what do we call the wide array of credentials we're seeing more and more of, and why are we calling them what we are without a consistent standard around naming, which leads to questions about what our credentials mean and can we trust them? Asking our employers, students, credential providers like our colleges and universities, policymakers, and of course, quality assurance entities like the institutional and the specialized accreditors. This is the purpose of today's summit, to delve into issues around quality assurance. Can we take the type of innovations in credentialing on which so many of you in the audience today, many others are working around the US? And we know there are folks joining us today from other nations also involved in the rapidly changing credentialing world, especially around micro-credentials and stackable credential pathways. Though Credential as You Go is sponsoring this summit, today is not only about our incremental credentialing initiative, which is working to transform the nation's credentialing system to one that recognizes learning acquired along the learning pathway, not just recognizing learning at the end of the pathway, degree, which for many reasons is often unattainable for so many Americans. The National Student Clearinghouse upped the ante on that in their latest research, reporting that there are now 39 million Americans, up from 36 million, with some college and no credential. Is it really possible that many of these 39 million Americans did not learn some valuable information and acquire valuable skills that could have been credentialed along their learning pathway? Reason tells us this cannot be true. Reason also tells us we need a better system to capture quality incremental learning in all of its permutations. Degrees, certificates, micro-credentials, industry certifications, licenses, apprenticeships, and others. But we've heard in many discussions in the past year that we're not ready to change our system yet because the quality assurance entities are not ready for these changes. This is why we're here, to hear from a panel of experts representing institutional accreditation, specialized accreditation, and state systems of higher education from Colorado and New York that are already participating in major credentialing efforts. After the panel discussion, we'll open up the discussion to bring in audience questions and issues. So please put those into the chat or the Q&A, and Nan Travers will be sharing your questions with the panel. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Barbara Gelman-Danley, President of the Higher Learning Commission, who also chairs the Credential Engine Board, to moderate our panel today. Before joining the commission, Barbara served on the ground in a number of higher education leadership roles in Ohio, New York, and Oklahoma. I venture to say she's seen it all, and she also holds more than traditional academic degrees. She is also a professional certified coach, which means she holds 6 different certifications that require a lot of hours of training and coaching, including her certification as a master practitioner in neuro-linguistic programming. And that sounds to me like a lot of expertise and change. So Barbara, we're turning the Zoom gavel over to you to introduce the panel and lead us in this discussion about change. Is it possible, and what is it going to take?
Thank you so much, Holly. The first thing I want to say is that thank you to you, Holly. One of the terrific leaders in higher education and your colleagues at Credential as You Go for everything you're doing to continue the discussion. I'm very pleased to be joined by our panelists who made me promise through Holly that we would only say their name and organization because their backgrounds and expertise will certainly show in their responses. I'll start with my good colleague, Belle Whelan from the Southern Association of Colleges and Colleges. See, Belle, you're going to laugh. I always do this. President of Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges. I know it as SACS COC. And some of you still call it SACS, but I will remind you it's SACS COC. And Angela Kennedy, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Commission on Accreditation for Health, Informatics, and Information Management Education. And then we have two other experts who are working at the state level on the ground in this very important area. Deb Meckel, Assistant Provost for Assessment and Community College Education at the State University of New York. I used to be a part of that, the SUNY system. And then Kim Post, Chief Student Success and Academic Affairs Officer at the Colorado Department of Education. So accreditors, specialized accreditors, the state and CHEO offices are represented. We've been working on this idea of what do credentials mean at the Higher Learning Commission for quite a while. We've done our own study, we have a lot of research, and we're asking some basic questions as to what is the role of higher education accreditors, programmatic, formerly known as regional, institutional now, and others in this growing market. And I want to tell you that we go about this by doing annual trends, and the trends are just going way up as far as the role of credentials. And as was said by Holly, in my own experience, and many of you who already have degrees, or perhaps all the degrees you need or want, going back through the credential route for continuing education, professional development is excellent. I also want to say, as the chair of the Credential Engine Board, that there are amazing statistics coming out. Right now, there are over 1 million unique credentials in the United States, 350,000 plus in post-secondary education. Non-academic provider numbers are over 600,000. And secondary schools approaching 60,000. So you put all that together, and it's very clear that we all need to stay on top of what is going on with credentials. And I'm proud of our board and the work we're doing for the study, but I know many of you are doing other things. So I want to move to a series of questions with my good colleagues. And Belle, I'm going to throw the first one to you. You know, in these situations, how ready are accreditors to address the changing credential landscape?
Thanks, Barbara. I'll pay you later. I'll give you the typical accreditor answer. It depends. In this case, it depends on the accreditor and how many of their institutions are involved in implementing credentials, either on the credit or non-credit side of the house. It depends on whether there are programs already in place for which the institution has been approved and the credentials are merely a piece of that approved program. It depends on whether it's a brand new certificate or / credential and whether they would have to go through the substantive change approval process. So it depends, but the answer to it is yes, I think we are ready to deal with it because we've already been dealing with it. The challenge we have as institutional accreditors is we don't currently evaluate stuff on the non-credit side of the house. And a lot of these credentials are coming through non-credit education. And so in our agency, we are about to, I start to say fixing since I'm in the South, but we are about to put together a regional committee to talk about credentials and what do we need to do and how do we evaluate what's coming through the non-credit side of the house. We think we're pretty okay with the credit side, but the non-credit side where they're coming is fast and furious, and we just don't have the standards in place yet to deal with that.
So it sounds like the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools Commission on Colleges is right on top of this, and we'll get together some good representatives to look at the current market. Right. So with all of that each of you are experienced, I want to ask this question specifically about SUNY and what's going on in New York. Do you see from your perspective that accreditors are ready to look at this market?
So I think that Belle is right. They have been looking at this. What we have done actually is to apply the standards that are used for credit to what's been done for non-credit. So we have micro-credentials that are non-credit to credit, all those kinds of things. We require them to assess those programs the same way they would any other program. So the other piece that matters to us is that it goes through faculty governance, whether it's non-credit or credit. There is a process to ensure quality from the very beginning. We've been working very closely with middle states on this. And essentially what we've had to do, and we had extensive conversations with them initially when we began this process, what we had to do essentially is to get our institutions to be sure to include within the scope of their accreditation the credentials of less than a year. And it's a simple notification process. There's no cost to them. And that's worked tremendously well. We have about 34 institutions right now that are offering micro-credentials out of our
Thank you.
64.
Kim, I'm going to ask you next, and I do know because we work very closely with your organization that there's a lot going on. And I know that Bella and I both have discussed with the other regionals. We're hearing more about institutions who say it's not for credit. Now we want to move it toward a degree. How do we do that? So Kim, what's going on in Colorado? And you certainly have several people online who are watching you at this time from Colorado.
I'll try not to mess this up. So yes, in Colorado, we do have a lot going on in terms of all of our, portfolio of micro credentials and prior learning assessment, et cetera. And I think, for us, from the SHIO perspective, the institution first has to have the statutory role and mission that allows them to offer the kinds of degrees that they're wanting to. And then we have a portfolio of credit for prior learning things that we have that are currently in place. So, we have a work-based learning for college credit. We have military experiences. We have, the standard AP/IB. And then a new strand of work, which is looking at stackable credentials and non-credit credentials and how we bring those in, primarily probably through prior learning assessment. But, one of the great things that we've seen with the Higher Learning Commission is we passed a bill last year that enables some four-year institutions to address students who have stopped out and are wanting to earn an associate's degree at the four-year institution. So the first thing we had to do was pass a bill that allowed four-year institutions to be able to offer a limited number of associate degrees. And then we've been working proactively with the Higher Learning Commission, particularly to help accelerate the substantive change process with those institutions of higher education. So, I would say that, just like Belle said, it depends on the kinds of programs that we're trying to offer, how those are counted in our system, how we pay for those credentials, et cetera. But then also, how we leverage our partners in the Higher Learning Commission and other accreditors to help us think deeply about accelerating a process or making that process easier for institutions of higher ed.
Yes, I think you're using an example of the importance of the triad. And I know that my colleagues and I, Belle, who is with me today, do a really good job of trying to work with the states and keep them informed and work together, because sometimes we don't agree. And it's a good idea if we plan together. Angela, you bring a different perspective. What are your thoughts about readiness to move into the credential marketplace?
So for CAHIM, as a specialized accreditor, we actually encourage our colleges and university programs to innovate, to evaluate prior learning credit, credentials. Really, I think Holly mentioned before, there are lots of names for this, a lot of different terminology that's evaluated. We, on our website, we've sort of provided a definition where we will accredit some of these programs, the micro programs that are popping up in the colleges and universities within the body of the academic degrees that we accredit. So we are encouraging programs to develop ways so a student can enter in, bring in prior learning credit or credentials, can leverage that to achieve maybe some type of badge, micro certificate or certificate. And if they have to then move out prior to the degree, then they leave with something. So we are ready for this. We've been working on this for quite some time. I think other specialized accreditors have as well. And so they're addressing these things. I think probably one of the things that's very important as a specialized accreditor, if you have a credentialing agency or a licensing body, that you also work very closely with them to make sure there aren't any barriers that exist on the licensing side that prescribes curriculum or has some type of requirement that, often says you can't do that. And then we often hear, well, my institutional accreditor doesn't have a way we can do this. There's a barrier, or my programmatic accreditor, there's a barrier and we can't do this. We can't offer it. And so we are constantly, through our town halls, our summits, and the education we provide to the public and the programs that we accredit, to talk to institutional effectiveness, build relationships with your registrar, find out what your institutional policies are and how you can do this, because you can really be a great service to your students, your current and your future students. We also encourage them not to just to look at credit on entry, but you have in the health professions, we have a lot of people who are already working in the industry. So they may be earning badges, receiving professional development, which is quite costly through their companies or through industry, that they're earning while they may also be working toward that degree. So we also encourage programs to have conversations with students at advising and recognize what they may be doing while they're enrolled.
Barbara, if I can jump in to echo some of the things that Angela said, many times people have no clue whether the accreditor will accept something or not. If they don't see a standard on it, they assume we don't do it. And there are a lot of innovative ideas that we've approved that for which we have no standards, as it were, because we treat them on a one-on-one basis. So I would hope that there's no one in the Southern region membership that will say that we won't approve something until they've at least come to us to see if indeed we will. We have a lot of credit from prior learning, and that's the way we treat much of the workforce credentialing that's coming from the non-credit side of the house. Every institution has to have a policy on how they translate non-instructional stuff into instructional stuff. And that's how a lot of the credentials are being approved for us right this minute. But I've been here 18 years. I can't think of anything that we have said, to which we've said no, that somebody has brought us, just because it's an innovative idea. So please stop saying that.
Yeah, I actually really appreciate that, because actually I was going to ask that next. Accreditors are often accused of standing in the way of innovation. And I'd like to make a strong statement as well. The only innovation blocks are at home. It's not us. So work with us on what is possible. I think the most important thing is transparency. Reading about something in the press or coming up with a really big idea and ready to take it to market and letting us know a month before, that won't work. It's really important to talk to us and call upon the kinds of things that are needed. And admittedly, as someone is saying in chat, there are some federal compliance issues that can get in the way. And there are things that we could do about that as far as lobbying, and in some cases not. And so, well, we could always lobby. So I wouldn't say you shouldn't lobby, but in some cases we can't do certain things immediately. And let's be honest, folks, that's why a big reason continuing ed was set up at a lot of large universities, to be able to do many innovative, creative things outside the normal procedures. What about Angela, Kim?
No, because there's not qualified faculty, because there's not the space to pull it off. I mean, there are other reasons for saying no, rather than just because it's an innovative idea.
Right. What about the rest of you? I'm sure you've heard it before. You're standing in the way of innovation, and Angela kind of jump-started the discussion. Angela, do you want to add to anything you said?
Well, we do hear that a lot when I often hear programs complain that, professional associations are sort of moving in on our space. And because you're the accreditor, you're not allowing, or you're not creating ways where we can innovate. Well, we accredit programs, we evaluate quality. Now, as an accreditor, we want them to innovate. We want to encourage that. And that's why we have developed some programs to kind of spark innovation, but we don't have any barriers. We have in the healthcare space, there are some 300 plus license and credentials. They're offered by non-industry, industry, professional association, non-academic, and all of those types of learning experiences are competing with academic programs. The last thing that we want to do is be a barrier to innovation with our schools. But I can't tell you the number of times that we hear it. And so we ask why and where did you hear that? And, have you really evaluated your policies at your institution? And oftentimes we find out they have not. And so then we try to really share best practices. We have a lot of schools, universities large and small, both undergrad and graduate, from the associate degree all the way to the master's degree, where we encourage those schools to share what they're doing and how they do it and their policies and the specific departments and units within their college or university that they work with in order to make this happen.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm going to, if the rest of you don't mind to move us through all the questions, I'm going to keep going forward. But I am noticing an interesting point that was on chat, and that's about short-term Pell. We had this discussion very recently with the Council of Regional Accrediting Commissions. We still use that for that organization, even though we're institutional now. And there could be a big impact, because if we do short-term Pell, it will be tied to the kinds of things that are very specifically related to federal financial aid. So there's a lot going on about that. I'm going to jump to a question, noticing that we have several providers online here that are not from higher education. So within the credential world, the way we see it at HLC, a credential includes everything, the same way that it's defined by the Credential Engine software system that's being used. And that includes degrees and certificates and those kinds of things that could lead toward a degree. Sometimes there are partners with outsiders to do that. And sometimes there are third-party providers who do it themselves. So as you all are responsible for quality, what lane do you see yourself in with all of those kind of providers, if any?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think, one of the things we struggle with the most is how does a non-credit credential or something that lives outside in a third-party space have currency in a higher education system? And in order to do that, you need to ensure that, one, it's aligned with the institution's role of mission, it's aligned with the current quality standards that they have, and that you're able to demonstrate that there are student learning outcomes that are aligned with courses that are in the institution of higher education. One of the things I always say is that, a third-party vendor can offer whatever kind of credential that they want, and students certainly have the opportunity to pursue whatever pathway they want in terms of learning and continuing education. However, if what you want to do is to have that course or competencies embedded in an institution of higher education for consideration of credit to move a student along a pathway, then it has to be aligned with the student learning outcomes that exist at that institution. When I hear from students and from other organizations, the two complaints I hear the most are, my credits won't transfer and HLC gets in the way. Those are the two things that I hear the most.
Well, they're wrong.
Well, but what I would say is that, there's a ton of myths around what HLC does and what HLC or accreditors don't do. And I think when I think about this, I think about what is the institutional approach to ensuring there's consistency across the institution, and that consistency has been acknowledged by whatever accreditor that you're using. Great example for me is, concurrent enrollment accreditation of or approval of faculty to teach concurrent enrollment and dual enrollment courses. This comes up a lot for us.
Mhm.
If your institutional policy says that no teacher on your campus can teach a course without a 4-year degree or a graduate degree or whatever that is, then that is the policy also for dual enrollment. If your institutional policy says that you can do something different, then it has to be consistent with whatever you're teaching in your institution with whatever you're teaching outside in order to be acknowledged for credit.
So let me move back a little bit into the discussion about what lane you are in. So are you in the lane of accrediting institutions? Are you in the lane of getting to the program level? Do you provide any guidance to your institution who go into partnerships? Those are the questions that are being asked of us. So Deb, what lane are you in?
We occupy multiple lanes, Barbara. It's not a simple answer. But I would say that as a system, one of our major ways to influence, obviously, is through system policy. And so what we have been doing is finally, after many years of revision, reworked our credit by evaluation policy, which was first published in the 70s. So this is finally now updated. It's going to the board in February. And this provides for things like guarantee of transfer of credits. It provides for things like suggestions as to how faculty can review external credentials for inclusion in their degree programs, which would ensure the alignment. So there's a lot of that type of activity going on. The other policy prong is the micro-credential policy, which was developed a few years ago. And we have that on our website. I can put the link in the chat. But basically it outlines what the process is, what the requirements are, what kinds of things institutions have to consider as they're going to offer micro-credentials. So things like stackability, portability, industry alignment, and quality. So all that's, part of the process, the two-pronged approach. And our role with the accreditors, I meet with Middle States regularly as a system representative, and it's to make sure that we're all on the same page, that we can act together, that we can inform each other, and that we can make sure that we are doing what we can in the interests of our campuses. So my role with the campuses is to try to help them make sure that they are in compliance with accreditation standards. And my role with the accreditors is to make sure that they understand the needs of the campuses.
And so what I'm seeing, and I'm going to turn it to Belle, is that we have accreditation standards and we have ways that institutions can be innovative, and we're all saying that. And yet, are the accreditation standards sufficient for covering, and I want, because you're setting up a group, we're curious to hear what that will mean, to cover the quality of what is going on with these credentials. And somebody else is expressing the interest in equity, and the whole issue related to that is the Credential Engine, other reports, certainly our internal large report research we did, that students who otherwise would not learn what they need for a job or whatever, this opens up the equity door altogether. It's not just a traditional credential. So, but quality assurance, how are you looking at that? How do you think that group, kind of questions will you pose them?
Well, if I had the answers to those, I wouldn't need to form the group, but one of the things that was mentioned is working with what I call educational entities, non-institutions of higher ed that offer educational offerings. If an institution of higher education is going to transcript something on their transcript as having given credit for it, then we hold that institution responsible for the quality of whatever the credential or experience is. And so that's one of the challenges that was mentioned. Yes, you need to make sure that the faculty who are offering it, are qualified faculty, however you define qualified faculty. You need to make sure that the student learning outcomes are identical to something that you would accept in your own academic program. So that's where some of our institutions run afoul of getting some of those credits credentials brought into their institution because they can't do that, or because that non-entity doesn't meet it. So of course that's our fault because that's our standard. And so if that's what you're defining as our fault and we're standing in the way, yep, then we do, because that's how we define quality. We define quality as people knowing what they're talking about, to offer it, and that the things that they're teaching are relevant to whatever the credential is that they're giving. That's how we do it right now. I know back in, Barbara, you may have just come on board when there was an institution in your region that relocated to ours, and they started offering an online education degree. And they were the online provider And some of our Texas institutions wanted to offer it. Well, we had to go back and say, you know, your folks who are these wonderful technology instruction people still have to meet the qualifications of faculty teaching at our institutions, and your curriculum still has to be approved by the by the faculty at the institution who's offering it. So we're still doing that right now. And that's how we're dealing with all of the credentials that are coming through, whether they're micro credentials or whatever, if they're coming from outside of the institution itself. And that's what I'm trying to get this committee to tell me. Is there a better way to do that? Is there an easier way to do that? Is there a more acceptable way of doing that, and yet assure that the quality is still, high quality?
You know, and I've noticed that Roy Swift from WorkCred is on. Roy was a big part of credential papers we did. Somebody else made a very good observation in the chat. There are other accreditors. Now, that term accreditor could be used in a looser way than a recognized accreditor by the U.S. Department of Education or very recognized within their field. So I can give you an example. One of my credentials is Social Emotional Intelligence Coaching Certification, Institute for Social Emotional Intelligence. Fabulous job. I didn't need to go spend $100,000 at an institution. I learned a lot. And one of the reasons I do that is because if I try it out, then I see, where were we with HLC? What do we need to learn? But I say that to be provocative, because if the accreditors are being accused of not being innovative, do not figure out a way to deal with this, not to worry, others will. So I think that's really important.
The other thing, Barbara, is there's an assumption that institutions of higher ed have to accept every credential that's being offered. And they don't, just any more than they have to accept any credit from another accredited institution, which they don't. That's entirely up to the institution. And one of the things that we try to do is to be less prescriptive, and leave it up to the institution to determine what it accepts and how they accept it. They just have to have policies and explain it to us to our satisfaction that it's going to meet higher education standards.
Yeah, there's a lot we can all encourage, but we can't make things happen that we think we are overstepping our place. I think that's really important. I would like to ask a question of each of you about how can we help our institutions understand this emerging market? Because I think a lot of our institutions really know it. Some get into the wrong partnerships. Bella and I'll give you an example, attended a White House convening when I first came on board, so close to 9 years ago, 110 degrees, waiting to get into this building. We walked in, there are 110 providers in there, and they weren't from higher education. And I remember one person mentioning, and I will be cautious, the credential he offered and how well the students did who graduated with that credential. But at that time, which is 9 years ago, he said, but I tell them not to say where they got it because it won't be respected. And I thought, you don't even realize what you just said, because we were sitting there with some very fine third-party providers. But I don't think our institutions all know how to look at this and how to have the right partnerships. Any suggestions from anyone on the panel?
Go ahead, Kim.
Just a comment really about this. Higher education or the workforce and our ecosystem is changing faster than higher education, I think is in some cases is ready to acknowledge. That the speed of change is going so quickly that unless higher education really leans into the application of workforce credentials, counting credits, thinking differently and innovatively around how credentials are offered and honored and things like that, then we risk becoming irrelevant in the entire marketplace. So, just kind of, it's a broad statement, but I stand by it.
So I would add that I think it's important for accreditors to broaden the standards to include non-credit and to include all the other kinds of things that people do. We have actually been working with our institutions on how to assess their non-credit. And then as they are looking at doing non-credit to credit pathways, it's all about learning outcomes. And it's all about how those translate from one into another, whether it's through articulation or whether it's through some type of assessment process. But I really do think that a lot of what we need is already in the standards. It's already there. We just have to translate it for people to help them understand, what they need to do.
I think all of you have great comments that you're making. The issue for us that we're looking at is a matter of who do we involve in these discussions?
Mhm.
And I know that each of you had, as you set up an advisory board, you work with people, you work with the institutions, and I've worked in some of your systems. You really have to get outsiders involved. We had WorkCred involved, Credential Engine involved, we had IBM involved, et cetera, in our discussions, because we stepped outside of the way we normally think. Okay, so I just throw that out for consideration. Competency-based education really is an opportunity here. It's built on the idea that as you move forward, you learn something. Would any of you like to comment on the role of competency-based education as setting perhaps some examples for quality assurance and this movement toward more recognizing more credentials?
We have several institutions who had submitted prospecti for approval for totally competency-based programs, and then they backed out and went to a more of a hybrid model. And in asking, why did you decide? Many of them said it was because faculty were afraid that they were going to become obsolete, that because they didn't have to stand in front of a class anymore to teach anything. And when we said, but they have to develop the objectives, they have to be the ones to assess whether students have met them. They just, I don't know, that they felt there was more work than it was worth. But most of our institutions that are doing anything competency-based are doing it as a hybrid model. Some courses, you still have to come in. Some of them you can sit for a test for them. I think that that's different on one level than credentials. Because credentials can be competency-based, they can be, you come sit in the class for 8 hours a day for a week, or 3 days a week for 8 hours or whatever. It depends on what it is. But the whole point is the institution has to decide whether it's going to just offer a credential and it has nothing to do with any degree that they offer, or that they're going to take their degrees that where they all have already identified student learning outcomes and parcel them out into stackable credentials. That's the biggest challenge, and as was said before, this industry is changing so rapidly, and the business community is just saying, I need all these employees. I don't need them to have a 4-year degree. I don't even need them to have a 2-year degree. I just need them to know how to deal with these widgets or deal with these people or deal with this team or whatever it is that they need in a very short period of time. The community colleges are accustomed to dealing with this. They have advisory committees all out the yin yang for every program they have. It's the senior institutions that are becoming involved in this that makes it new. Some of them are doing a great job because they have had longstanding practical programs or applied programs where it's easy to build a credential off of that. For the other more general ed, liberal arts kinds of programs, it's a little more difficult to come up with some kind of credential for that particular one. But I think all of our institutions are getting into it now. They recognize that it's an enrollment issue because I can bring students back just, for even 1 or 2 classes, and especially our state institutions that are publicly funded based on full-time equivalents. I'll bring them in one course at a time or 10 courses at a time. Let's just get them in there. But our role as accreditors is to ensure that no matter what you're doing, that it's the same quality that you've been offering, for all the years that you've been in existence.
It's interesting watching the chat. Thank you, by the way, Belle, because folks are identifying where barriers come from. And one, I like the term a CBE killer. The first institution where I worked, it was actually competency based. And this is decades and decades ago, until business and industry wanted to see grades. And then we had to translate to some grades. I thought the way we were doing it was actually much better. It was a sad day when we had to move away. It was called mastery learning at the time, but it was very measurable. But outcomes are being brought up in the chat as well, that many of our institutions don't really know how to assess if learning is taking place and the transparency of it. But one of the biggest obstacles that naturally is being mentioned is the credit hour. So in general, we have all these people here who just know what they're talking about, and you're doing a great job with in all of your states, et cetera. But what is the federal government, what parameters need to be really pushed against in order to move forward in 2050 to get there to 2030? What's in the way? Certainly the credit hours brought up, but there are other kinds of things. So I'm sure as accreditors, you've had members say, well, why did you say you can't do that? And there are times you said, well, federal compliance, you're not judgmental. You're just saying we can't. But what needs to change? Let's imagine it's 5 years from now. What would we change at the federal level that could make higher education in the United States stronger, and those outside of higher education offering credentials stronger, so that our citizens reach the very strong goals set by Lumina Foundation a number of years ago, and all of us who want to have more people educated?
I laugh because I plan to be retired 5 years from now, so I don't.
Yeah, but your brain will be clearer then. So it's 5 years from now. I'm gonna push you guys 5 years from now. It's what do you want to happen so that Colorado will be successful? Your students, Kim. What has to happen at the federal level?
Reauthorizing the Higher Education Act would be awesome at some point. But I think at the local level, and how that translates into federal policy is how are we thinking differently about the ways in which students are learning in general. And I do think that there is a point here around the credit hour. How do we look at the credit hour as not just this box to be checked, but how do we think about breaking apart our courses in a way that is more digestible to students? So if you're taking English 121, for example, can you meet one of those competencies or the equivalent to a credit hour instead of 3 credit hours? And then how does that translate into a transcript, and how does that lead into a degree program or a certification option that is eligible for federal financial aid for students who are, low income or have a hard time accessing those resources? So I think it's that, but I do think that, higher education needs to really lean into reimagining this linear pathway to degree programs and think much differently about the circular nature in which students and learners and earners are approaching education in general.
Thank you so much. And as the rest of you answer, I want you to really imagine you're reading the Chronicle of Higher Ed 5 years from now, and it's talking about where we are on this, what needs to happen to get there.
I think financial aid needs to be reimagined, essentially. We have to be thinking differently about how we fund education in this country. And it's so much degree-based, so much graduation rate oriented. This is not helpful. It does not mirror what students' goals actually are. The other thing, and I don't know that this is sorry, Barbara, I don't know if this is a federal regulation thing, would be more the work we need to do with our own institutions on translating what grades actually mean. What did students actually learn? I mean, any number of faculty that I've spoken with will say, well, industry say they want certain things. Well, they get that from a liberal arts degree. I say, well, we are not articulating well what students have actually learned within those degree programs. And a better way to communicate that would be, I think, extremely helpful.
Yes, we're in an either or environment. Either it's workforce or it's liberal arts and
Yep.
ability to communicate and speak, and they're not mutually exclusive.
Mm-mm.
Okay, Angela, it's 5 years from now. You're reading the Chronicle of Higher Ed. What do you want the legacy to be?
I would like to see federal financial aid fund something other than students enrolled in an academic degree program. That's probably the big one for me. I would also like to see accreditors, programmatic specialized accreditors, accredit something other than higher education programs. I think those are the big ones for me. I think sometimes when we talk about accreditation as accreditors, we don't think about the industry programs that are out there. Industry plays a huge role in defining quality and credit and what their needs are. I mean, if we really think about this, when we produce that graduate, right, in higher education, someone graduates and their goal is to go to work, they're going to be evaluated by industry from that point forward. So they play a huge role in what happens here. And so engaging with the industry to meet their needs, I think is super important. And one of the ways that can happen is accreditors can accredit other things outside of higher education. You also can fund, federal financial aid could fund things other than just students. And I know that probably might sound, unusual for a higher education accreditor to say that, but I think that's probably going to open some doors for a lot of people that are very closed right now.
I'm very happy to hear all of this and the good conversations that are going on. I'm going to ask one final question, then we're going to turn it over because this audience is ready to talk, I can tell. The final question is, are we staffed accordingly at our organizations to handle this? And I don't mean numbers, I mean the right kind of people and the numbers. So that's a brave question, but I'm asking it.
We're working on it. I've got 2 positions being requested by SubChange right now to help with just the workload because of all of the new requests that are coming in for micro credentials and new certificates and things that are offered. It's tough. I think that we're going to be subjected to the labor market just like every other employer is, and we have the half full glass opinion would be we have a lot of people leaving higher ed for whatever reason, either the politics of it or they're tired of it or the pay from it or whatever. And so I think there will be a cadre of people out there who are experienced in higher education and what it does and should do and expected to do, that we could find staff. The half empty glass says, though, that if they're tired there, they're not going to be any more energetic when they come to us. And so they may not apply. So we're back to that first answer I gave, what it depends.
Does anybody want to else answer that?
I think we are moving in the right direction at KHIM. I do believe that our resource needs will increase in terms of the qualifications of the people that work for KHIM as well as the number. I see this as being, well, it's a part of our strategic plan, of course, for the next 5 years, but I definitely think that we're on the right path, but we are not there yet. So we just have to continue to push the envelope and move forward.
I brought this up because I don't know if traditional academics are the right people to do this. And I'm just going to put it right out there. We've got some folks talking about UPSEA, other organizations, etc. I know what we are doing at HLC is we're being fully trained and we're becoming an agile organization, somewhat of a term that seems unusual for creditors, but it gives us an opportunity to move appropriately, listen to the voice of the customer, the users, and try what's called minimal viable products, which is test things along the way. So there's a lot going on. What a fabulous panel. Thank you all so much for your input, and stay put, because I'm going to turn it over to Nan, who no doubt has questions that she is going to throw to me to lead a discussion.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And I'm actually going to start with Julie Uranus allowing to talk for a second, because early on she talked a little bit about what they're doing at UPSEA in terms of quality assurance and the non-credit side. So I thought I'd give her just a second to give us a very quick overview on that. Julie?
Oh, sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you. And such a wonderful, wonderful panel and a good opportunity for us to have this discussion. Yeah, UPCEA, University Professional Continuing Ed Association. So we're the folks that, the professional home for your continuing ed folks who have been in this space for a very, very long time. And so we have 3 different hallmark documents that are really representative of the development of quality credentials, derivative of an enterprise that is adequately staffed and focused on quality, in that program development. So I think I dropped in the chat our hallmarks of excellence for credential innovation. We have the hallmarks of excellence for online education as well, leadership, and that aligned directly with the CREC guidelines of old and the 21st century guidelines for online learning that exists in the online space. So in terms of that quality work, what we're really trying to do is get the word out to tell folks that are operating in this space, like these are the parameters, these are the things you should be thinking about. And we really encourage folks to really think about stackable credentials. And when you think about stackable credentials, inherently, you have to have a conversation about quality. You have to have a conversation around awarding credit for non-credit experiences, wherever they may have originated. So it's really exciting that this topic is at the forefront of everyone's minds, and that we see it as one of many opportunities to solve that jobs of the future workforce perspective that is so very important to our learners, as well as outcomes for our accreditors.
Thank you so much, Julie. And we've had a lot of questions and comments that have been going on in the chat that are really looking at these different different approaches, different groups looking at the quality and assurance aspect of it. So, we've got the accreditors on the institutional side, we've got the specialized accreditors. We also have accreditors that are sitting in different pockets of industry as well as international. And so some of the questions that have been coming up in sort of some of the conversations have really been asking around, how do we start to look at all of these accreditors coming together and thinking about the kinds of learning that we are trying to really be able to credential. So Barbara, I'm going to turn it to you to start, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, actually, that's a very broad question, because we do tend to work within just as our institutions work within their bubble, we work within ours as well. One thing we did with our work is we reached way outside of higher education. And we thought it was really important to hear from folks from business and industry, from the work creds of the world, the Credential Engine, other organizations, and also those that might be standing in the way. Whenever you set up a group, it's always good to have the naysayers there so you can bring them along in the process. But how is it that some of you engage other organizations, and how could we? I'm going to call on Deb, and then I'll go to Kim. Deb, I was at Monroe Community College for a number of years. I know that I'm not biased toward community colleges. I just know what they're doing, folks. I was also president of private university and worked at the state level. But how do you bring people together to get the kinds of things that we want to dream of for 5 years from now?
So we have very broadly engaged a variety of constituencies within the university system, and also, within industry. When we did the initial micro-credential policy work, we had continuing ed at the table. We had business at the table. We had faculty at the table. I think, for many of us, it's a natural. You mentioned earlier that a lot of the community college programs have advisory committees, so they're already connected with local industry. Other kinds of groups, I think what we have to remember is that our faculty don't get out much. And that's not a criticism of them, it's just a fact of the situation. So providing opportunities for them to see other ways of thinking about things, I think, is tremendously important. For a lot of the work we've been doing, I've had to do an awful lot of training about even basically the difference between grading and assessment. This goes back how many million years, but still people have difficulty around that concept. So there's still a lot of training that needs to be done, but I think you're right, bringing in the right people from the right places makes a huge difference. They need to hear different voices.
Yeah, and I think that it's really important, and I'm excited to see the kinds of things that you're talking about. In the old days, we'd call it charrettes. So when I was at a college, it would be, we'd have a charrette and we had all these ideas which we thought were perfect. And then we bring outsiders in and find out how we had no idea what we were talking about and how we needed to adapt. But Kim, I know a lot's going on in Colorado. So tell us about what you're doing with this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been super helpful for us right now as we're looking particularly at stackable credentials is to have industry specific colleagues gather in the same room. So, you know, we have had attempts at having just general industry represented and then just general faculty, but don't find a ton of value because I think the industry wants to know, how is this going to impact my workforce? How are we going to get the students that I need to have working for me in that space? And so now we have, you know, specific groups that are targeted towards early childhood or K through 12 or information technology or behavioral health. And that seems to be, it's much easier to see the what's in it for me. And also sort of broadens the perspective of faculty that have been working at an institution forever and it may not necessarily have an opportunity to be in the same space. Would also say that it's important to have the student voice in these conversations. So, you know, students tend to be a little more transient. However, I do think that there's just a ton of value and perspective to having the students sort of listening to the conversations that we're having and understand why it connects to me.
So I'd like to comment, Nan, you mentioned, this is a very good question you asked. You know, the reward system we have in higher education doesn't necessarily give the faculty an opportunity to get out there, as Belle mentioned, and others have mentioned the importance of getting out there financially, perhaps as far as travel, etc. But we encourage co-ops and internships and apprenticeships of our students, but we don't always provide that opportunity to faculty. So the reward systems would also need to adjust. And I would like to say, this doesn't just sit on the academic side. If you really, some of you are saying like, how do I set up an advisory board? If you really want to know how to do engagement, go talk to your alumni office, talk to the fundraising people. The friend raising stake could apply to this versus just, and then you're asking for action. The other side is, I just want to say, don't want to forget, I think this is a new continuing ed. I think continuing ed was set up, the land grant colleges, I don't want to go through the whole history. We have total experts online here, but it was set up for a reason. And this is happening for a reason. In other words, there are people out there, they want something they can get in a shorter period of time. They do want it stackable in some cases. In other cases, they already have degrees. There are experts who are offering it and they want it to result in something now. It's just how it is. They want to be able to get some immediate positive reinforcement in their lives. This is the new continuing ed. And what I would encourage is that many institutions, the continuing ed and the rest of the university or college are very separate, very, very separate. And I remember when I was at the state level in Oklahoma, folks were complaining on the continuing ed side that they didn't get to keep the money that came in. It went to the bottom line of the university budget. And the university folks were complaining that they don't get, you know, that we don't get what they're doing over there. And I'm not saying that's universal and that's still happening. Wink, wink. But a lot of these things get in the way. So I think that intra-campus interaction is really critical. So Nan, what's the next question?
Can I weigh in on that one before we go to the next one, please?
Oh, yes, Belle, I'm sorry, sure.
No worries. Just to point out, we have two, I forget what the original question was, but I think it had something to do with how can accreditors partner with other entities or something. We have two opportunities for faculty and staff to get to find out what's going on, first of all, because as you said, Barbara, they don't often get to travel. And so this is one way that they can. In the summer, we have what we call our Summer Institute on Quality and something. We just call it the Summer Institute. That the whole focus of it is how to develop student learning outcomes and how to assess whether they're effective and what do you do with the results after you get them. And I think that's where part of this starts, because faculty often have difficulty translating workforce certifications into credit instruction. And that's what they're being asked to do. Until we come up with a transcript just for workforce, things are still going to be filtered through the credit side of the house. The other thing is at our annual meeting, we broach these big subjects and have workshops from institutions that are already involved. Last year, we had the president of Credential Engine, no, yes, Credential Engine, I think it's called, to come and talk to our presidents about what's going on out there. And then we had workshops on, you know, which institutions are already involved in that. So I think a part of it is trying to avail yourself of the information that was made available at those, you know, to see what else is going on out there. The bigger challenge is, as an institutional accreditor, I step on the toes of programmatic accreditors when I start, you know, making too many rules and regulations about how to be responsive for these particular kinds of certifications. And so I think the conversations that we have when an institution is out of compliance with one of our standards, to share that information with a programmatic accreditor and vice versa is one of the ways that we do stay in communication with each other to know what our institutions are actually doing.
Thank you. Nan?
Yeah, so we also have had quite a few comments around the competency-based. When you had that question around competency-based education, it really got people pretty excited out there. And Callie Morrison, who's in Montana, has done a lot of work in the competency-based world. But she asks, how do we break the cycle of depending on the credit hour for these articulations? Is that the $1 million problem? And, you know, there's also been a lot of discussion in the competency-based arena about how do we really look at assessment? And this has come up in the discussion as well, in terms of, you know, what kinds of work could we really be doing to really assess what people know and can do? So what would be kind of the role of accreditors and, you know, at the state level, at the system levels, around really rethinking the credit hour and thinking about assessment? That's another huge question for you.
Well, I'll say to the close to 400 people listening today that it's a $3 trillion question. So the credit hour is something that I sat on a negotiated rulemaking a few years ago, and it was brought up by the former administration. It didn't go anywhere because folks that we haven't figured out an alternative to that when it comes to federal financial aid. So I used to say when I was over a large IT organization that the content drives the IT, it shouldn't be the reverse, the purpose. Well, in this case, the financial aid is driving decisions being made on our campuses, and it really should be the reverse. So that's a strong statement. It's apolitical because whoever is in charge, it's very, very difficult. But if I'm to kind of narrow down your question, could you just make it, you covered a lot. So give me a one-sentence question.
So the one-sentence question is, how can we really shift ourselves away from being so dependent on the credit?
Yeah.
This stuff is on the non-credit side of the house in the first place, so it's not strangled by credit. You know, institutions of higher ed are reimbursed based on seat time, and until that changes, you know, I don't know how else we're going to do it. That's one of those federal issues. They tried to do that. How long have you been here, Barbara? 9 years, 12 years ago, or 10 years ago. I think you had just come on board. And trying to find a way to redefine it. And they went right back to the same definition that came out of the Red Book at Harvard 300 years ago, you know, that we're still talking seat time.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. It really, it's very archaic. It doesn't make sense. You know, it's kind of anchors on our feet, which is why do you think there are outside providers who are not tied to federal financial aid?
Yep.
They don't have the anchors.
Right.
And the students, they have to ask the right questions of anyone, where they attend college or not, whether it's outside. But the learners, lifelong learners, learner record types of folks who want to keep a good learner record of everything across their lifetime, the credit hour is the credit hour. Or there was recently an article about one of our institutions that wanted to have a shortened degree. And the comment was made, HLC standing in the way. And I'm like, well, you know, I don't exactly want to say it's not us. But the thing is, it is a barrier. Now, what are you seeing in your states or as a programmatic accreditor that you are finding a way to be in compliance, but work around this or not?
I think the biggest example actually has been approval of distance learning programs. So if you're looking at online education, something that's solely online, you don't really have the same kind of judgment of seat time that you would in a face-to-face course. And the best way that they have to deal with this, at least for us at the state education level, is to say, what's the equivalent? You know, give us an equivalent in seat time. So it's still there, and it's still there with regard to how faculty are compensated. That's all built around seat time as well. Credits. I mean, we'd have to completely abandon what we currently do and completely reimagine it in order to come up with something different, I think. And we don't, you're right, we don't have an alternative at this point. Not
Yeah,
something that is going to work across all the different areas.
Yeah, my 5 years from now legacy would be that we've been able to reimagine it. Got to think
That'd be
big.
great.
What
That'd
about
be
the
great.
rest of you? What about the rest of you?
Well,
So right now at CAHIM, we have a 3-year project on competency development for the largest number of our academic programs that we accredit, and they will span from the associate up to the master's degree. We can write the competencies, we can roll those out to the schools, but the schools will still have to package a curriculum in a way that is going to match seat time. So we are hoping that through education, we have probably about 1.5 years of competency development work, and then 1 year of faculty training where we'll train the faculty or provide free training to the some 350 schools that we accredit. But still, in the end, it'll be up to the institution to make those adjustments. So, but I'm with you, Barbara. I'd love to see in 5 years where that goes away. Maybe that should have been on our wish list for the federal government. No more semester credit hours.
I'm envisioning a big protest of 400 people who are on this call. We all go to Washington and we protest this, and of course, that's not going to do any good. But it is something we've said. Some folks wrote democracy gets in the way, etc. But it is a big challenge. Nan, do you have any easier questions?
well,
No, I
just-
don't have
just
easier
one-
questions.
just
go
one
right
other-
ahead.
Oh,
Yes.
I'm sorry. One other comment that I would make, in that state funding formulas are still based on seat time and credit hours and the value of a certification versus a 2-year degree versus a 4-year degree. So, you know, if there's a brave state out there that really rethinks the way in which we fund institutions of higher education from a completion and a seat time space to something more competency based as well, then I think you might see some changes as well.
Yeah, and New York has just this past year, they passed part-time tuition assistance program, which is great because that does really work well with our micro-credential efforts. But basically it's 6 to 11 credits. So they're still working off of credits for everything connected with the financial aspects of things.
Well, you know, continuing ed and credentials are different, but the reason I mentioned continuing ed is because it was a huge shift. And this is a huge shift. This is, you know, one of those really big shifts that are going on. And if higher education doesn't figure out what their role is, it's not a problem. There'll be less institutions, there'll be less higher education. It'll be taken care of otherwise. Nan.
Yeah, so the next question kind of pulls in I think something that we're kind of almost touching, but not really directly responding to. And Barbara, you have mentioned, you know, the technology. There was a couple of things that people had said in the chat around how the technology is driving some of this, not just what we want to do. So, you know, things like the student information system. You mentioned financial aid. And that, you know, with the credit hour, we could all do a protest. But the root of that question is, in what ways could accreditors, could state Department of Higher Ed, system offices, how could you really help move the needle here? And in what ways could you be helping the institutions be able to find the way that they can move forward?
In our region, and I'm sure this is true in the other formerly known as regional accreditors, it is our members who make up the rules.
Mhm.
You know, staff doesn't sit up and dream up stuff for institutions to do. I hate to bust that bubble if that's what you all think, but I have a whole lot better things to do than to sit up and say, oh, let's put these institutions through this. And it is our members who come up with our standards and who determine what's important. And it is our board that's elected by those members that approve the policies by which those standards are carried out. And so that's why we're putting together a committee, if you will, from across the region of institutional members who are heavily involved in credentialing to see what are you doing, how are you doing it, what should we be doing for the rest of it. And from that, a standard and or policy will evolve. And so that's what we're doing in the southern region. It takes time because you just can't get it done in, as quick a time. It's not going to take us 20 years because like I said, in less than 5, I'll be gone and I want to do this before I leave. But I think it's important for people to understand that the institutions have to speak up and say, this is something we think is important and this is something that we want you all to address. If it comes from the staff, and sometimes it does, we then go out to the institutions and say, hey, we're hearing that you're doing this. We've had enough people out on visits to know that our institutions are heavily involved with this. What do you think and how should we move forward with it? But until the institutions speak up and either tell us what they want and or how they want it done, then I'm not sure that the accreditors are going to be responsive to our institutions.
Yeah, I'm going to answer that before I turn it over to everybody else. That's exactly why we became an agile organization. Because the way Agile's set up, it's impossible to operate in a vacuum. And you do things in an iterative way. You reach out to those that are impacted. In our case, we see that as beyond our members. So it's a lot. Others, any other responses to this question?
I mean, I would say that the speed of change is ramping up faster than I think we're able to keep up with it. And if the pandemic has taught us one thing is that we can be flexible and nimble, and I think that has really challenged institutional leaders and faculty and staff to understand that there's much more nuance and complexity that we can apply to our current context. And I think if we have not taken some of the innovations that we implemented during the pandemic forward, then I think we will have failed our students and learners and our economy.
That's a good wrap up for that question. Let's go on to the next.
Okay, well, Noel Giesel from Colorado did ask a question around equity, and I'd like to draw that question out a little bit more. We know that credentialing, there's a real equity divides in who obtains credentials and not. And with the movement of incremental credentials, one of the hopes is that that would narrow that gap some, where especially if everybody was getting incremental credentials. So could you talk a little bit about some of efforts that are happening in each of your realms around really thinking about equity and credentialing?
I would just say when you, as we move into that questions, we have institutions that are magnificent examples of this, that they're very responsive to what's going on in the market. They recognize Arizona State University is always used as an example, but it's for a reason. Iowa State University, very, very innovative institutions that are looking at everything from student intent, which has been mentioned in the chat, to student success and how to get them there. And as we've said at HLC through some outside work we did, it's not always what our colleges and universities think that the students should do, although, as someone said, a lot want to get degrees, but what is their intent? And how can we acknowledge that along the way? So what examples do any of you have from your organizations or your institutions you'd like to give?
From a past life, maybe 3 iterations ago, the institution at which I was working was heavily involved with a local industry. And that's where a lot of these start with whatever the industry is in your area, whether it's a region, a city, a cul-de-sac, whatever, and where employees are needed. And so working with their success came from working directly with the industry representatives to say, what are the skills that you need students to have in order to be successful, in your employ? And the curriculum was then developed with input from them. A lot of my institutions, especially my community colleges, are still doing that and are being successful. That's limiting on one level because it's only feeding the local community. But many of those students do move and then are able to go and become employed someplace else. But I think a lot of the efforts in my region right now are going to be community centered, for lack of a better word.
I
Appreciate
I-
that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I mean, I do think that you have to be conscious of not establishing tracks that track certain students into one area and other students into another. That if you're developing a program, that there's a continuum whereby every student on that pathway can have access to the multiple options that are out there. And so I do think we run the risk of we run the risk of continuing to track kids into certain pathways, and we just have to be really cognizant of that.
Mhm. Any other comments?
Just that we really need to be able to review our data and make sure that the data are disaggregated in such a way that we know what's really happening. And that our micro-credential work at SUNY is new enough that we don't have those data yet. But I think, making sure that our information systems are set up so that we can be sure to get the information we need.
Nan,
We
next question?
Yeah, I was just going to also add that we do know that there's a lot of initiatives that are happening at the institutions that are really looking at equity. I do want to kind of shout out the project called REACH that's in 6 different states that is currently working on really developing pathways that are more equitable. So there is a great deal of work to do. I'm actually going to bring Holly back on because she has a question and I thought maybe she could ask it.
Hi, glad to be back. This has just been a fascinating conversation. So I want to go back to your 5-year scenario, Barbara, and what could it be like? And one of the questions is that this is particularly for probably you and Bill, but so you were called regional accreditors, then you became institutional accreditors. If you start providing services to companies, corporations that are providing credentialing or third-party groups, does that mean your name's going to change? Will the feds say, we want you to provide credentialing is not just owned by higher ed anymore, and who knows 5 years from now? So curious to know what you think could be happening. And if there is short-term Pell, will some of that drive some of this? So I'm really interested in the employer connection part.
We have always been institutional accreditors. For us, since 1895, that has never changed. It's just that when we first opened business, it was the institutions in our area that decided there were enough similarities among themselves that we formed the regional co-op. And I think that's true for all of the other regionals. We've always been institutional accreditors. The recognition of us being institutional now has come from the fact that in the previous administration, they decided that the organizations that were previously known as national accreditors, where their institutions were all over the country, but they all had the same mission, did the same things as regional accreditors, where our institutions were geographically reduced, and our institutional missions varied all over the place. But we were doing the same things. And so they decided just to refer to us all as institutional accreditors. The reality is we've not seen a lot of movement, from the traditional regions. And so among ourselves, we still refer to ourselves as regional accreditors, or you may hear us say formerly known as regional accreditors. But I don't get caught up in what we're called. The bigger distinction, I think, is between being an institutional accreditor and being a programmatic accreditor. Those are the 2 big differences. When Barbara mentioned a few years back, we went to the building beside the White House, and met all of these providers, and there were over 100 of them we had never heard of before. There was then a call for somebody to become the accreditor of those entities' programs. And so far, nobody has stepped up to the plate for that. So there is not an accreditor of non-higher educational programmatic programs, as it were, in regarding workforce certifications and stuff. I know that Ralph Wolf was originally involved in an organization that was looking at doing that, but nobody has done that yet. And so many of them are sending their credentials back to ACE because they've been, or CALE, because both of them have been evaluating outside of higher ed experiences, for a very long time. But right now, that's not what we do. We accredit institutions of higher education. And until that scope changes, that's what we will continue to do.
So Holly, I'm going to answer that. Thank you, Belle. I'm going to answer that by reading our revised mission statement effective 2021. Advance the common good through quality assurance of higher education as a leader in equitable, transformative, and trusted accreditation in the service of students and member institutions. Our vision statement, HLC will be the champion of quality higher education by working proactively in support of students, institutions, and their communities. The difference here is we became a student-centered accreditor, okay? So I cannot answer your question fully. I would say stay tuned because there are some things underway, and that's all I can say about it now. But if you look at students, you move beyond, and it's what you do with the federal government and other services you can provide separately. So I would just say stay tuned for HLC. That's it for now.
So
I
there's
just-
one.
Go ahead.
There's one, I was just going to do one last question, but did you have something else, Holly?
I was just going to make a prediction, and this is just me. This is not Credential to Go. I think 5 years from now, there will be many more companies, third-party groups that will be providing credentials of micro-credentials of the sort we've been talking about, driven partly by skills-based hiring, and that quality assurance will keep coming up to the fore because employers and others are going to ask about who is standing up around quality assurance, and they're going to turn to the more traditional accreditors to say, can you help? Unless they develop a whole new one. So I personally think that 5 years from now, something is going to have occurred that is going to be opening those doors. So that's just my personal prediction.
And we welcome them, truly. No, truly.
And so, Holly, with the work that you're doing, what do you want your legacy to be toward that 5 years from now?
I want a fairer system for all Americans. That is my number. I don't want 39 million. And it's more than that if you count the number of people who leave graduate level programs where they didn't receive any recognition of their learning to be transcripted. So I think it's probably 45 million, but that's my guess. I want us to have a fairer system that recognizes learning in increments along the way. And I want us to have a better database of information. You all know that I think we're also working on a library, a learn and work ecosystem, digital library, a wiki model that we could all own, where we can find out information about what is going on in our system that we don't have, that many other nations have. We don't have that in the US, and it's not a federal responsibility. It's a community based. So those are the two things that I care most about today. But Nan's probably, I think, got a final question, then we'll do a wrap up.
So my final question really is around how each of you, what you think incremental credentialing, where it's going, and where will this look in 5 years? So picking up the 5 years, but thinking about it from the incremental credentialing perspective.
I'm going to ask everybody to give a 1-sentence answer to that, and that way we'll stay on time.
I think it's going to continue to grow and challenge both our institutions and our accreditors to ensure that there's quality in whatever's coming out.
I think it'll provide learners and earners more transparent options.
I agree with that. I also think that innovation often happens faster than regulation reform.
I think we're going to see rapid change, and there will be some forced changes to higher education, maybe even to accreditation as well.
The changing credential landscape will change learners' lives and as a result, their communities and our country.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm now
Thanks.
going to turn it to Holly to bring us to a closure.
Thanks. And we're unfortunately at the end of our time today. That doesn't mean we're finished discussing this topic because a lot of issues have come up. So what we're going to do is have a recording of today's summit at the Credential As You Go YouTube channel. We have a channel and we'll let everyone know when it's available. And we encourage you to share that with your colleagues and use it however you feel fit to do. We also are committed to wanting to continue this discussion. So we're going to talk through issues that maybe we didn't go into in as much depth, and we're committed to planning future events like this to discuss this. So stay tuned for more of those kind of discussions. And just a huge thank you to the panelists who joined us today. You bring a wealth of information, and we're so glad we can raise these issues so frank with you. And we had a really large audience. We're grateful that you all joined us, and we're just going to sign off and give you 5 minutes back of your lives.
Thank you, everybody.
All very much, and reach out to each of us if you want more information. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.